Hi, folks. Danny from the Small Venue Survivalist here again, and it's time for another installment of my video on mixing a live record for the band Suspect. So today's topic is going to be getting the vocals put together. I'm going to focus on the vocals for Ren, the band's bass player, because that vocal track was the most interesting to work on. And so I think it has the most value in terms of being educational. To get started, let's listen to the vocal track completely dry with no processing, just as it was recorded. Just as a quick note, the sound files that you're going to be listening to have been normalized. And I do recognize that in a certain sense, when you're trying to compare things, it's better to listen to files that are all of the same apparent loudness because what we tend to do is think that louder is better. In this case, though, I want to preserve the overall effect of the dynamics processing changing the average volume of the vocal. And the easiest way to hear that is if I just normalize everything and you hear that the average volume goes up or down from sound clip to sound clip.
I'm wondering why you did me like you did, and no answer comes to mind. All I could see is that it wasn't me. We weren't what we wanted to find. So far, yet so near. In the shadows, your worst fear. So hard, I tried to see why you did what you did to me. But I'm wondering why you picked me for the one when you couldn't even love yourself. I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
The very first thing that I wanted to do was apply dynamic range expansion to the vocal track. And the reason for this is that, speaking technically, the noise floor for the track is relatively high. That is, you can hear the other instruments, you can hear the guitars and the bass, and especially the drums bleeding into that vocal mic. That's not signal, that's noise. What I want to have is just the vocal by itself. And if I could totally isolate the vocal, I probably would do it. But I can't. So the answer is to use a gate that has some of the dry signal mixed in. And what that does is make sure that when the gate closes, it's not as abrupt and extreme as going all the way down to silence. But what this does is this helps to clean up the vocal a little bit, and it also gives us some room to do compression later on because the compression will necessarily result in the noise floor coming up. So I want to minimize that if I can. So now let's listen to a part of the track that has this dynamic range expansion applied.
When you couldn't even love yourself, I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
Now, it's true that even that expansion sounds a little bit unnatural. However, when this vocal track gets mixed in with everything else, the contribution from the other tracks will help to make those transitions a little bit less noticeable. The next thing that I got into was multiband compression. Multiband compression is different from regular compression in the sense that we take our signal, we split it into a number of pass bands, say lows, low mids, high mids, and highs. we compress each pass band individually, and then we mix them all back together again at the output. This kind of tool is very, very powerful, and it's become really my favorite processor for doing broad brush frequency sculpting, especially in an initial sense over a raw track. It's also very helpful for polishing the overall frequency balance when a performer is very dynamic in terms of moving around in comparison to the mic. So Ren likes to put on a pretty animated performance with his microphone, and so he moves around a lot. And that's really cool from a visual perspective. But in terms of tonal consistency, it can sometimes be a little bit of a hurdle because he'll get really close to his mic and the low end and the low mids will come up, and then he'll move away and they'll drop off. And so by using multiband compression, I can minimize the dynamic range of just the lows and the low mids and then mix them in at an appropriate level in comparison to the high mids and the highs. So let's take a listen to this processor in action.
So hard, I tried to see why you did what you did to me. But I'm wondering why you picked me for the one when you couldn't even love yourself. I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success.
Now it's time to move on to the EQ. As I said, the multiband compressor is what I wanted to use for my broad brush frequency sculpting. So I really didn't want to get into using a whole bunch of EQ. However, I did want to filter out the low end after I worked on the track with the multiband compressor. The reason for doing this filtration post that compressor is because I didn't want to end up setting my compressor's processing to compensate for things that I had thrown out. What I wanted to do was get everything evened out without throwing anything away first, and then chuck out the bottom end to make room for things like bass guitar, kick drum, things like that. Here's the vocal with that high pass filter applied in the EQ.
I'm wondering why you did me like you did, and no answer comes to mind. All I could see is that it wasn't me. We weren't what we wanted to find. So far, yet so near, in the shadows, your worst fear. So hard, I tried to see.
At this point, it was time for some traditional full bandwidth compression. In this context, a big reason to use this compression, even after having used multiband compression to start with, is because it's very hard to deliver a studio quality, ultra consistent vocal when you're doing all the things that Ren has to do during an actual show, which is be putting on a visually engaging performance and also singing and also playing bass. At some point, the vocals are going to be a little bit inconsistent, and that's where a compressor can really help out. So let's take a listen to the compressor in action.
I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
What you heard there was the complete, fully processed individual vocal track. At this point, it was time to mix it in with the other vocals. And what that meant was doing processing on the vocals as a whole to make the entire vocal experience, if you will, consistent and also sweetened a little bit. So let's first listen to the whole group vocal dry with no additional processing except for what was on the channels.
I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
For this mix, I wanted to apply some full bandwidth compression to the entire vocal group so that when the big harmonized choruses came in, the necessary jump in overall vocal level wouldn't suddenly wash out the rest of the mix. Here's what the vocal group sounds like with that compression applied.
I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
At this point, it was time for the final little bit of polish and sweetening, and to me, this means reverb. I personally like to use a convolution reverb, which is a processor that works by using specially prepared recordings of actual acoustical spaces. Or, of course, you can use recordings of other reverb processors. Here is the final, fully processed vocal group ready to be mixed in with the rest of the tracks.
I found out too late that you were using me, and you almost had your success. My words are your mirror. Can you face your worst fear? And now what can be said now that our love is truly dead?
That's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you got something out of it, and I hope you'll come visit me over at smallvenuesurvivalist.com. Until next time, cheers!